What's up, y'all? Welcome back to Fish at the Moment. In this video, I'm going to be breaking down a technique from Japan that is taking over bass fishing, from the professional levels to the local lakes in your area. It's called hover strolling, and it is an absolutely deadly technique for catching finicky bass and also some really big bass on pressured bodies of water. I'm going to be going over the gear, the baits, where to fish this bait, how to retrieve these different baits for the hover strolling technique so you can put a lot of big fish in the boat this year. Let's get into it. The original concept behind hover strolling is very simple. Basically, you take a 90-degree jig hook and a light nail weight and put it into a fluke style bait or a flat tail worm. This will allow you to get a gliding motion out of these small baits and basically hover or float them in the middle of the water column. The goal is to target suspended fish or just finicky bass that don't like a fast moving bait that has an aggressive fall, and also to take advantage of a different center of gravity in these small baits. A lot of guys throw baits like Ned rigs and shaky heads, which put the weight at the head of your worm. This means that the bait is going to fall head first down to the bottom. With hover strolling, you redistribute the weight down the center of the worm so you get more of a gliding action, and the bait sometimes will even spiral or dart side to side. Basically, by taking weight away from the head of the worm and putting it more towards the center, you get a different fall, which gives that bait a different action. It's a really cool concept, and guys have been doing it now for probably 5+ years. It's not necessarily a brand new technique, but it's kind of just hitting mainstream bass fishing in the same way that it took a few years for the Ned rig and the Neko rig and all these other techniques to really gain widespread appeal. There have been some recent top finishes in Bassmaster Elite Series events using this technique. Matt Steffen and I have been experimenting with a new style of jig head, and he got a nice top 20 finish on a shallow dirty water lake flipping with a hover rig. And there's just a lot of potential that has been untapped with this bait. So I'm going to basically walk you through what I know about the rig, how I set up my hover rigs, and how I have been using them to catch fish from the winter this past year all the way to these warmer months as we get into the spring and the summer. I'll start out by going through the equipment and baits I use for hover strolling. When I first started trying this technique, it was very frustrating because the standard way of rigging a bait for hover strolling is using a 90-degree jig hook and then inserting a nail weight into the head of the worm. The problem with this is that you lose a lot of worms and a lot of nail weights because there's no good way of holding that bait onto that 90-degree jig hook. That's why Matt Steffen and I started Core Tackle Company to come out with our own hover strolling hook called the Hover Rig. Basically, we designed this rig so that you don't need to insert a nail weight into a worm, and also you have a better way of locking on your plastic to that 90-degree jig head so that you don't go through a ton of worms and you actually get a better fall because more of the weight is shifted to the body of the worm. Let me show you how to rig the hover rig. It's really simple after you see it done one time. This is the 1/0 hover rig with 3/64 ounce of lead on the head. All you're going to do is take a worm or a fluke or any bait you want and insert the hook point 1/4 inch below the head of the worm or the bait you're working with. So you basically have that hook point a little bit below the head of the worm. You're then going to slide that hook into the body of the worm, threading it up until you get about just past the hook bend and you get to that straight part of the shank. You're then going to put the hook point through the worm, slide the bait up onto those keepers there, keep sliding it until basically the plastic meets that weed guard. You'll then twist the worm around a little bit, and then once you get it straight and you feel like it's right where it needs to be, you're just going to pull the plastic up over the top of the cone and then push it back down. Now you have that bait perfectly rigged. The weight is internally positioned inside of that worm. It's not going to go anywhere because that cone is locking the head into place. And I'm doing this as an example here, so it's not the straightest I've ever rigged one of these, but usually you can get a lot straighter if you're not trying to talk through it at the same time. But either way, this will work just perfect. That bait will have a nice gliding action. You have a nice weed guard there, and you are set to go fishing. Nice little deal right there. Right now, the hover rig is available in two sizes, a 3/64 ounce with a 1/0 hook and an 1/8 ounce with a 3/0 hook. You may have actually ordered these already if you've seen Matt Steffen's videos on his YouTube channel, and we have actually had these baits out for about 2 months. I just haven't made videos about them because the demand has been overwhelming over at coretackle.com. Thank you so much for those who have already made their orders of the Hover Rig and have shared their stories with the bait, what's worked with them, and all the fish pictures you've been sharing. I really appreciate it. It's been super humbling and super cool to see you guys using this bait and kind of learning the best ways to throw this bait with us. Since we've got our first prototypes of the Hover Rig, I've probably rigged 100 different types of plastic on this thing just to see what would work. And some of my favorites that have been the most effective on the lake are the Strike King Caffeine Shad in the 4-inch size. It seems to have a really nice glide on that 1/8 ounce 3/0 Hover Rig. And I caught some really nice bass this winter on the Live Scope, just gliding that bait around suspended bass, both closer to the bank around bluff walls and shallow points, and also over some deeper creek channels. I've also had a lot of success with some of the flatter bluegill style baits like the Depths Bull Flat and the Bellows Shad. There's some really good, basically flat bluegill imitators that glide amazing on that Hover Rig on both the heavier and the lighter size. Another category of bait that Matt Steffen and I have had a lot of success with the Hover Rig are the flatworm category of baits. There's the Berkley flatworm, obviously, and then I've really enjoyed this Nico Baits Zaza Leech. It has a very flat profile and it glides through the water like crazy, and it barely sinks. So when you're fishing this up in, let's say, 2 to 3 feet of water, you still get a lot of movement and glide because this bait actually is made out of the Elastec material. I'll link all these baits I'm talking about down in the description below with all the different recommendations. You can also see our favorite baits over on coretackle.com, linked up with the different sizes of heads. We're gonna be putting out as much information as we can about hover trolling on our website, coretackle.com, so you guys can learn more about it as we learn more, because again, we're still trying to discover new ways to fish this technique. I'll get into the retrieve and the areas here in a second, but as far as my gear, really I have 2 setups with this Hover Rig. And I'm using the lighter head. This is the 3/64 ounce 1/0 hook. I like to pair that with a Denali Covert Light 610 medium power spinning rod. I have some 10-pound Sunline braided line connected to a 6-pound fluorocarbon Sunline FC Sniper leader. I like that lighter test with a little bit shorter rod that doesn't have a ton of backbone to it, because it allows you to cast this light bait. It's a very light bait with a light piece of plastic. You can fire it out there and you can get those bites, especially with the braid to the 6-pound fluoro. You can really get a nice connection to that bait and you won't miss your bites. One thing I will say is with these, you definitely need to be a line watcher. You need to watch that line, watch for it to hop or bump, because a lot of times these fish are not necessarily going to pull the rod out of your hand. They'll just start feeling heavy, or the bait will just feel weightless. So you have to really pay attention with this rig, because you are just kind of floating it in the water column, and they'll just take it out of the middle of the water and just hold it. And a lot of times you won't even feel them on if you're not paying attention. So just a little quick tip there. And then with the bigger Hover Rig, the 3/0 1/8 ounce size, I've been throwing that on a Denali Lithium Pro 7'4" medium heavy power spinning rod with 8-pound Sunline FC Sniper fluorocarbon leader and some 12-pound Sunline braided line. I like a little bit heavier, stouter rod for this heavier Hover Rig because I can fish it a little bit deeper and around thicker cover. I like floating this bait around standing timber in the wintertime. I've actually caught fish fishing this over the top of brush piles in the winter as well, but it also works straight just working on the outside edge of grass, around rock piles and things where bass might be sitting a little bit deeper. So I go with a little bit stouter equipment. You can cast these bigger baits with that 1/8 ounce head pretty well on this heavier rod, and it just allows me to get a good hook set, pull those fish out of deeper water, and it has been a great little setup for me right here. I'm pairing both of these rods with a Denali Fission Pro spinning reel, nice reel that isn't going to break the bank for you, so definitely check those out as well. And that's really my main setup. I've talked through a bunch of the baits. Now let's get into the actual retrieve with this bait and where I'm actually throwing the Hover Rig. As far as the retrieves go with the Hover Rig, I found 4 really good options. The first I found this winter when I was fishing offshore brush piles. Normally when I'm fishing brush piles, I like to throw jerk baits over the top of them, but I was noticing that a lot of the bass were following my jerk baits back to the boat but not eating them. That's when I pulled out a very light hover rig with a small fluke style bait like this. This is the 1/0 3/64 ounce size. I would fire that bait over the top of brush piles, and then I would basically just let that bait sink super slow for like 10 to 15 seconds, get down in that 8 to 10 foot range, and then just slowly twitch my rod and reel my reel handle. I'm just twitching the rod, reeling the reel handle, and barely moving that bait. If you point your rod down at the water and just shake that rod very slow, that bait will just quiver in the water. It'll kind of pendulum naturally back to the boat and just kind of shake and quiver and move very slow. If you watch it on live scope, you can barely see that bait moving forward. It's just kind of hanging there in front of the fish's face, and they cannot stand it. They will choke that thing, and you can fish it right behind people who are fishing the same brush piles as you. They're throwing Alabama rigs and jerk baits and catch the fire out of them. It's really cool, and it was kind of my secret weapon this winter around the brush piles. Another retrieve that worked great for me this winter is with the heavier size of the hover rig, that 1/8 ounce size. Now I basically target fish with the live scope by looking for them in open water suspended around standing timber or just chasing balls of bait fish. It worked best when the fish were suspended no more than, let's say, 15 feet deep, because this hover rig doesn't fall super fast, and a lot of times they would swim away before the bait would get to them if they're in deeper water. But if those fish were suspended in that 10 to 15 foot range, I basically cast the hover rig just past the fish on the live scope, let it sink down, let's say 8 to 10 feet, and as soon as that bait was, let's say, 2 to 5 feet above the fish's head, I would stop the bait from moving and just let it pendulum on a tight line right past those fish's face. So basically you just hold your rod steady and let that bait pendulum right in front of their face. And something about that natural gliding action with those flat fluke style baits just falling slowly past their face, they would not be able to resist it. They would eat it and you get them in the boat. It's very similar to how I fish a Damiki rig, but the thing with the Damiki rig is the Damiki rig will fall head first and kind of fall past those fish a little bit faster. And a lot of times the fish would not react to the Damiki rig, but when I throw the hover rig over to them, they would react because it was a little more natural and it had a little bit more of a gliding horizontal fall to it. So really cool stuff, and caught a lot of nice fish like that. Now, for those of you who don't like using electronics that much, you can also catch fish on the hover rig just casting it around isolated cover like boat docks, riprap, laydowns, stumps. Basically fishing at the same places you would throw a wacky rig worm, a Senko, a Ned rig, or a shaky head. If you rig it on a worm like this, a finesse worm, you can actually rig the head a little bit further towards the center of the worm to give that bait a unique fall with a center weighted basically motion, and when you work that worm, it'll swim through the water a lot different from your traditional Texas rigs, wacky worms, and Ned rigs. You can also rig this bait up on a beaver style bait, and that's actually something that Matt Steffen has been doing recently, and he got a top 20 finish in a Tackle Warehouse Pro Circuit event on Lake Eufaula, flipping the hover rig in the 1/8 ounce size around shallow stumps and laydowns for bedding bass, and also some pre-spawn and post-spawners as well. One more effective retrieve of the hover rig I discovered this past weekend was out on Table Rock Lake when I found a school of spotted bass suspended over a long offshore point. The bass were chasing shad and kind of suspended anywhere from 10 to 15 feet of water, just randomly chasing around this point. I picked up a fluke style bait on that 1/8 ounce 3/0 hover rig, fired it out to those fish that were chasing on that point, and basically burned my reel handle 5 or 6 times and then let that bait fall, giving it a little bit of line, opening up the bail, closing it, and then once that bait fell 5 to 10 feet, I would burn it again, almost like you'd fish a hair jig. Reel it 5 or 6 times really fast, let it fall, and repeat. And they were choking this little hover rig, and those spotted bass, even though they weren't that big, were getting all over it. And it's really cool to see that, because even though the fish weren't that big, I know that there are better quality fish that will get on those same spots as we progress into the summertime, and it gives a lot of options for fishing this hover rig offshore for schools of fish, suspended bass offshore, ledge fish. There's all kinds of stuff that I'm very excited to try this summer. It'll be my first summer with the hover rig, so I'm going to be using this non-stop in this size, all the different sizes, to try to unlock the full potential of this rig. I really appreciate if you guys gave this rig a try and let me know what you think as well in the comments after you get this bait. Give it a try and learn for yourself what this bait is capable of. I honestly don't know what to expect from you guys because there's so many possibilities, so many different types of baits, so many different areas, retrieves and things like that that are possible, especially when you fish this bait in all regions of the country. So again, really would appreciate any feedback you guys have on what you like about the rig, and also maybe different sizes and things you might think would work well in your region of the country or in your specific techniques that you're trying to try. We will definitely take the feedback into account, and if it's something that sounds like it'll work for a lot of people, we will put those sizes into production and get those out to you so that more people can try the technique. Again, check out the hover rig at coretackle.com. I'll leave links down in the description to the hover rig, to all the gear I talk about, the baits, everything like that. Thanks for checking out this video. We'll see y'all in the next one.